I've been procrastinating on this for a long time. I think it's time I finally get around to it. Hello and welcome to, I think I said it was a Sunday, so that's what I'm going with. This video was recorded a long time ago, back a few months before we did our move, which I'm sure I've talked about at length in the Let's Play videos, but I've been procrastinating editing this because for whatever reason it's just been really weird to me, the thought of going back and editing footage, seeing our old place, and that is part of the reason that the vlogs have kind of been dead. So I think I'm finally ready to rectify that and make peace with it. So what we're doing here, I'm going to give some backstory in this next clip that you could see. We're going to be making Mom's recipe for tomato sauce. And I don't know how I'm going to chop it up, but that's what we're doing here. So I'm going to hand you off to past me. Like a week or two ago, Mom was talking to Emily, and they were going back and forth, and apparently Andrew thinks some over-the-counter pre-prepared sauce
in a jar
was the best thing he's ever had, sauce-wise. So we're going to prove him wrong.
So to start, I'm going to tell you what to have ready to prepare. Have some garlic, some onions, because what Italian doesn't eat garlic? I use San Marzano tomatoes now with a can of crushed, because I like to make a larger amount of sauce, so we have leftover. Some Italian seasoning. You can use fresh if you want to. Salt, pepper, and for the most part, that's it. And my secret ingredient, anchovy paste. I try to make sure I have everything on the counter ready to go. With the San Marzano tomatoes, since they're whole, I usually put them into the food processor or a blender.
Either or is fine. We just had the food processor ready first.
And I puree it and put it in a jar until I'm ready to put it in the pot to cook. So I'm going to start by chopping onions. And I usually chop one large and one small. I don't seem to have a small one today, so I'm going to do the large one. And possibly half of one. Because I also chop enough onions to put in my meatballs. So I cut this off to get the skin off.
And then make a slit and manually peel any excess.
Because I don't want skin of the onion in my sauce. I find that to be gross and disgusting. If I'm lazy, I'll put the onions and chop them in the food processor, but mostly I'll just cut it in half and slice them. And maybe a little bit of dicing after I cut this all through. So my mother, when she chopped her onions, would chop the onions and put them right into a saucepan and start a sauce right then and there. I find it easier to chop and have all my chopping done first.
Probably saves time.
And I have a small little bowl of onions. And I sometimes will take a little more from this. And I actually saute onions and garlic in a separate pan without anchovy paste. And after it's cooked, I mix that into my meatballs. Because fresh is always better. I have some fresh garlic. And I usually use a huge amount of cloves. For the sauce itself, I use about 7 cloves of garlic. And you can, again, buy these pre-peeled, which is so much easier.
Usually. But fresh is always better.
That's what they tell me. But the pre-peeled is a fresh garlic. I know Olivia knows how to do this, but for Emily, I'm not sure. I'm assuming you know how to do this.
One of you should know.
But you take your knife, it helps peel the garlic easier. And it smushes it down, but the skin comes right off. And I usually cut the end off if it looks brown. And that is how you do it, and you have to do it for each and every clove. If you see, I chop and mince the garlic for the meatballs very, very finely. And I just wanted you to see how fine a chop that is. And I put this in the same bowl as the onions for the meatballs. But that's what the meatball looks like. That's what I put in it after I saute it. And then for the sauce, I will just kind of chop it across and then once in half. Not as fine. Now the garlic is all chopped for the sauce, and the next thing I always recommend to do, clean up your work area so that you can move to the next step. And the next step is the tomatoes. And this is the first time I ever got chopped tomatoes in puree. So I'm not sure how chopped they are. Like I said, usually the last couple of times I've been using whole tomatoes. But chopped is good. Chopped looks pretty. Chopped. I said chopped. So I may just leave them exactly like this and not even need the food processor, because I happen to like the chunkier version of tomatoes. And because I really don't like adding water to my sauce, it seems that this is actually saving me a step of using the food processor this time. What I normally will do is, instead of water, I will add like a red wine to give it flavor if it needs more liquids. In a few minutes, I'm gonna start my onions with a very, very small amount of oil. Like barely any, because
It typically doesn't need very much.
And there's nothing worse than an oily sauce. So I really just coat the bottom so that I can saute the onions and garlic. So I turned on the heat. I usually keep it on high to heat up the oil. And then once I feel that it's heated, a few more minutes, you can tell by how much heat you feel on your hand. I don't suggest you put your hand in the oil, but above it is fine. And then I start with the onions, and I use a rubber spatula, and I put it in the onions. You hear it sizzle a little bit, so you know the oil is heated nice and hot. And I mix it in, and I just let it cook. As you can see, I keep stirring this around, and it starts becoming a little translucent. I'd say for maybe about 3 or 4 minutes I would cook the onions, maybe even until they start to brown a bit. or not. It's really your call on how you prefer your onions to be sauteed. Again, I diced them so that they're a little bit chunky and they mix well with the tomatoes in the can. And I usually test an onion to see how soft they're getting. Once they get there, I add a little bit of salt to make them sweat, and they stop. They then will start to, soften even faster because there's a little bit of a moisture in the oil. At that point, I add the anchovy paste, which gives it a little bit more of a salty, smoky taste to it. I'm going to need more anchovy paste soon. I would say probably I use about a tablespoon. Roll this up to squeeze it out to get all of it out of the tube, because it's like one of those hard aluminum tubes that make it difficult. So you add this anchovy paste and you chop it up and you mix it in very well, and it'll coat the onions. You see how it's starting to nicely brown with the anchovy paste? And again, you don't have to add too much salt to this because of the anchovy paste. And then I don't add any more salt until after I test the sauce after it starts boiling. One of the things I also do is add some pepper at this point. I normally add a dash of cayenne pepper, but I don't have any. And I use the Italian seasoning nowadays. Sometimes I'll even just open this and add it. And again, I find that this also helps absorb the oil when you add it before the tomatoes. Because I hate oily sauce. In case I didn't make that clear before, I'll make it clear now. I wish you could smell this. It smells delicious already.
And one day we'll have smell-o-vision.
And then, last but not least, the garlic. I take one can at a time and I stir it in to get the onions and the garlic in.
Ready?
And Benny's going to assist me. Try not to splash me too much.
I can make zero promises. I'm doing this one-handed.
And then I also have a can of crushed tomatoes, which are a little more pureed than the San Marzano ones. And this is obviously to help thicken it a little bit more and to give me a little more sauce, because
We like to make it last.
Sometimes what I've done to also help thicken the sauce, if I'm going to use just crushed tomatoes, is I add a tablespoon of butter to the onions. Just to...
But that's entirely optional.
Right, that's an optional thing also, but it gives it a little bit of added flavor and...
Thickness.
Yeah, thickness. But with the chopped San Marzanos...
Don't really need it.
You don't need to add any kind of thickness to this. If anything, you need to add a little bit of a...
Water?
Yeah, and at this point, I would not even do that, because we're gonna... Once this comes to a boil, we'll test the flavoring to see if I need to add anything else. The only other thing that I don't have on hand right now is the bay leaves, which I also like to put in because that helps absorb some of the acidity of the sauce, and it gives it a nice little flavor. So it's starting to bubble slowly, as you can see there. So I will mix it. We'll test it. Everyone took a little bit of a bite. Taking a little bit of salt.
Careful not to burn your mouth. I've done that before.
Oh, Vinny. Only Vinny.
That's not true. You've done it too.
And again, I eyeball my measurements of everything because I've been doing this a long time, I guess.
I guess you could say that.
But I also know that everybody has their own kind of idea of what salt is or how much salt something needs. I now will move this on a lower flame to the back, covered, and cooked for about an hour.
Stirring approximately every 15 minutes.
Because the worst thing that can happen is it burns to the bottom of the...
Which I've also done before.
Yes. So, that is the sauce process, and I will start doing the meatball process in a minute. So, to start with the meatballs, we must turn the right burner on
That would be helpful.
and heat up the pot a little bit. Then, add the smallest amount of oil. When I say small, I mean small. And I put
The onions and garlic.
So now that, and this has way too much oil in it.
Well, that's your fault.
I know. I'm going to use a slotted spoon. But first I put the meat. I want this to kind of get warm before I start really mixing. So we're going to let it sit, but I'm going to add this oil. Not all of the oil.
But some of the excess.
Yeah, like we're not draining this first, because that gives it a little extra moisture. And try to get as much of it as you can out of the pan. Otherwise it starts to burn when you cook the meatballs in it. Sauce boiled. We're going to take this and put a spoonful of the hot sauce in here and keep the sauce covered. And I put a little bit of seasoning salt. A lot of this, garlic and herbs.
And a bunch of breadcrumbs.
Just to cover it over. Gonna let that sit. We took some pork. These happen to be on the ribs.
On the bone.
I mean on the bone. The ribs are on the bone. And I put garlic and herb. I'm gonna try to get some color on these before we stick them in. Nicely browned, even the ribs on the bone. And then, now that it's drained, I'm just gonna plop them in. I want to make sure I cover everything with the sauce. I'm gonna actually definitely add another can of crushed tomatoes. Again, we're just gonna cook on a very low flame. Make sure that all the meat
Is submerged.
And all the sauce gets mixed together. And flavoring wise, I may have to add a little bit of sugar because there's a little bit of bitterness to Stop and Shop brand sauce.
So, now is the point in the process where you need to stop for a second. And remember, you may have central air. We do not. It is hot. I hate the summer.
So first things first, I always line a cookie sheet with some paper towels so that when I do finish cooking the meatballs, they'll drain here because you never want to really have a lot of oil in there. Next, I take the meat that's been kind of sitting here and I break the egg into a bowl. So if I get shell in it, it's easy to pick out. Throw the egg in there and I chop the egg and kind of mix it in. Not a huge egg fan in my meatballs, but
it helps hold it together.
I use a spoon to do the first mixing, and then I just kind of dig in.
It's gonna feel gross.
So gross.
There's no two ways about it. But it's the best way to handle it. And you're gonna have to do it eventually anyway to actually roll the meatballs.
I would like to add a little bit of pepper. You really want to try to even the distribution of all your ingredients into the
mass.
The mass of meat here. And then I make my meatballs.
Just grab a handful and roll. Very simple.
And I make them about this big. So, I put sausage into the sauce. I am overflowing. So I've been eating the sausage that didn't fit. And I decided, since I can't put the meatballs into the sauce, I'm just going, and they're so moist. I hate that word. Wet enough to, that's what she said. I'm putting it in my convection oven.
You can do it in the regular oven. It's just,
So
this one is here for us.
And it's not as, doesn't heat the kitchen as much as the oven, so I'm going to use this one. 2 rows of meatballs for 20 minutes.
At what temperature?
At 375. In the regular oven, I usually cook it at 400. I'll keep my eye on it. You do have to keep a close eye on it, and I would switch.
Move them around.
Yeah, from shelf to shelf. Every like 10 minutes or so. I have now taken the meatballs out of the oven. And the meatballs are done. Now we just have to do the pasta. And I am going to test it. And hopefully it is good.
So, we never properly showed off the finished product. So I'm not 100% sure what to say here. Other than, that's our beginner-friendly sauce, I guess. There's nothing really else for me to say, except for, I'd like to thank you all for watching. Hope you had yourself a damn good one, and I'll see you tomorrow.